right. So yeah, so this webinar will be recorded and available upon request. If you would like to participate, we'd ask you to participate through the chat function. And if possible, if you could mute your mics and keep your cameras turned off, just so everyone has good quality throughout the entire webinar. And if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, just contact Tessa at tlatchmore@crca.ca. She'll put her email in the chat there. And to talk about what we're going to be talking about today, this is our itinerary. We'll do a little introduction on the best practices for source water protection, and then we'll go into our experts' presentations. So we have Kim McCann and Francis Pick, and they'll do some information about harmful algal blooms for everybody. And then we'll go into questions. We had a few questions that were submitted beforehand, and so we'll try and get through all of them. If we don't, no worries. I will just get everyone to submit their questions as much as you want, and we'll get back to you via email if we don't answer them today. So we'll start off with our best practices presentation. So the best practices is a Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks initiative. It's a document that they released in 2001 to help protect Ontario residents who are not protected by the Clean Water Act or by a source protection plan. So basically people who are on private wells or surface water intakes, and it provides them with information and suggestions that they can use to better protect their source of water and have a better understanding of what kind of activities can harm their drinking water source. So you can expect in this document helpful suggestions and advice like testing your drinking water regularly with the free testing bottles from health units. You can see them advise that you have an inventory of potential contamination activities. So if you take a look at your property and what you do on your property, keep a list of what may be a concern for drinking water. And then maybe even implement a protection zone. So if you're on your property and maybe you just say around this 30 meters around the well, we're not going to do X, Y, and Z because it could potentially harm the well. Another thing too is to visually inspect your wells and septic systems annually, because we know they're buried and we can forget about them. So it's important that we actually make a point of going out and taking a look at them just to make sure that there's no damages. And if there are damages, you can fix them instead of having them continue to get worse and worse. Additionally, you can pump out your septic system regularly every 3 to 5 years, or when it's a third of the way full. That will actually help prolong your system's life and help prevent drinking water contamination. As well as using eco-friendly alternatives for commercial products. So just being aware of what you're using. And other things like conserving water when possible, disposing of hazardous waste in the appropriate locations. And if you do have a heating system oil for your home, just make sure that you have the correct storage, so an insulated double-walled tank for fuel storage. And then a lot of you may be cottage owners. If you are on waterfront property, try and keep a land buffer, and that helps reduce the surface water runoff. So you may be wondering, why are these little activities important to implement? Here are some of the reasons. It actually helps protect human health and the environment. We'll learn about the environment part today, as well as the human health. And then it helps avoid the high cost of cleaning up your contaminated drinking water source or finding a new one. It extends the life of your system so you don't have to replace them often. And you can have a better understanding of what you're using your land for, as well as increase your public awareness and accountability for these drinking water stewardship items. And another big reason is because a lot of people in municipal areas, they'll have all of these resources. So they'll have water treatment training, water testing, all of these things are provided to them through the city. But when you're on a private system, you don't have a lot of those resources. So the aim of this document is to actually help remove this gap and educate our private system owners on what they should be doing, or what are things that they can be doing to better protect themselves and their drinking water source. So without further ado, That was our little presentation on the best practices. If you are interested in learning more about them, you can contact your conservation area, your local one, and they'll be happy to give you more information, or you can check out our websites. But with that out of the way, we'll hand it over to Kim McCann. She is our Senior Public Health Inspector at Leeds, Grenville, and Lanark District Health Units. And she'll be talking today a little bit about the public health aspect of harmful algal blooms. So I'll stop my screen and then we'll let Kim take over.
Okay. Coming, just hang on. Can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Okay, great. So like Natasha said, my name is Kim McCann. I'm the lead, the Senior Public Health Inspector with the Leeds, Grenville, and Lanark District Health Unit, and I've been here for several years and have a vested interest. I grew up on one of our local lakes and still play and live there as well. So harmful algal blooms are kind of near and dear to my heart. So please let me know if the presentation isn't moving forward. So harmful algal blooms can show up in any lake. We typically see them during the warmer summer months when after the water has warmed. So usually in the summer and early fall. And oftentimes we do see them in shallow, slow moving water. Those areas are more vulnerable, so you might see them in very shallow bays or around your dock. However, in saying that, they can still be present in deeper water as well. So it's the nutrients in our lakes and rivers and ponds that actually cause and support harmful algal blooms. So when there's a lot of phosphorus or nitrogen, you're going to see or potentially see harmful algal blooms. So throughout the presentation, we do have some pictures. Just want to make an acknowledgement that some of them are our pictures that we've taken. Some of them have been provided by local lake associations and also by the Ministry of the Environment. So like I was saying, harmful algal blooms can thrive in warm, shallow water, particularly in slower moving waters. And blooms are most likely found around your shorelines and along your docks. Dense blooms may appear to be a bluish green color, hence the former terminology of blue-green algae. However, not always. They can actually have some reddish color and brownish color tinge to them as well. So they renamed them harmful algal blooms. Oftentimes it will look like pea soup or turquoise paint that has spilled on top of the water. And I have a really great picture later on in the presentation to show you as well that kind of illustrates the coloring. It can look like spilled paint on top of the water and have various swirls in them. It can be solid in its consistency, and fresh blooms may smell like freshly mowed grass, but once they start to degrade and become older, it can smell like that rotting garbage smell, so not pleasant. So this is a picture of one of our local lakes. It was provided to us by the Upper Rideau Lake Association, so you can kind of get the idea of the paint spill and the swirling aspect from this picture. So what are the health effects of harmful algal blooms? Well, HABs cause aesthetic concerns, of course, but some blooms can actually produce a toxin. So the toxins are released when the algae bloom or the algae cell walls start to break down. So when the cell of the algae is starting to die, or if it's been damaged by a chemical. So toxins can be harmful to humans and animals, and then the level of toxin may be higher when the bloom is concentrated in an area. So if you're seeing that dense paint-like or pea soup-like color, you may consider that to be more concentrated, so assume that the toxin is higher. You cannot visually tell if an algal bloom is producing toxin or not, but it's always best to use caution and just assume that it could potentially be there. So what does the toxin cause? It can cause itchy and irritated eyes and skin, hay fever-like allergic reactions if you swim or bathe in the contaminated water. Some may receive headaches or fever, abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting if you actually ingest the water. So if you're drinking any of the water that may have the toxin in it, or even consuming some of the fish that may be in the present in the bloom area. So liver and brain health, when it's very concentrated and you've ingested a lot, can become a problem. And of course, children, being smaller people than us adults, are at a higher risk. Pets and livestock can also become very ill and die from the toxin of the green algae or harmful algal bloom. So surface water is never safe to drink without effective treatment. So although a harmful algal bloom can be one particular source of illness in surface water, we have to remember that it is an open source of water. We have boats using it, we have cottagers, so there is a large amount of bacteria in the water, and you can also get other chemicals such as oil and gas in the water as well. So surface water and shore wells may be at risk of contamination by harmful algal blooms. So when you are using surface water, you want to make sure that you are treating it, and it's important to remember that UV lights and chlorination don't work on their own. It's best to contact or consult with a water treatment company if you are going to use your surface water for the purpose of drinking or cooking or even as a showering source. And don't forget that boiling, unlike bacteria, the toxin, when you actually boil food, so it could be pasta or potatoes, or even for the purpose of drinking, will actually concentrate the toxin, so you're effectively ingesting more. So when if you are using lake water or river water as your source of drinking water, make sure that you do consult with a water treatment company to ensure that you do have proper treatment on. And treatment will consist of more than just a UV light and chlorination. It would include things like proper filtration, so a 1 micron filter, plus a reverse osmosis system, plus either ozonation and chlorination with proper retention tanks, and then also a point of use filter. So that goes directly onto your faucet. So all of those water treatment system devices have to be used in conjunction, not just one is actually going to reduce the toxin to a safe level. So if you do notice that there is a bloom within the area that you play for recreational purposes, maybe avoid that area. The following factors may help you decide when you want to actually resume your normal activities, such as swimming. So faster moving water, of course, will dilute and move the toxins out more quickly than stagnant, flowing, moving water. So assess your own local conditions. If you're starting to notice skin irritation, then that's a good indication that the levels of toxin may be higher. So you'd want to get out and rinse off with some clean water. Obviously, don't rinse off with the lake water, and make sure that you dry off as quickly as possible. And then surface water also has the potential to be contaminated with other microorganisms such as bacteria or chemicals, which can also affect your health. So you want to avoid ingesting the water, and make sure that you're watching little kids, because oftentimes they like to spout water as a playful game. So just be careful of that. So consumption of fish, if there is fish that is in a bloom, of course, they're consuming the water as well. So we really would advise against eating that fish. The toxin will concentrate in the organs of a fish. So particularly do not avoid consumption of the liver or kidneys or other organs of fish if it's been caught in a bloom area. So what can we do to help reduce algal blooms? Well, we really need to control the amount of nutrients going into our lakes and rivers. So if you remember before, it was the phosphorus and nitrogen going into our rivers that can increase or encourage blooms to grow. So avoid using household fertilizers on your waterfront properties. You want to avoid or reduce having agricultural runoff going into our lakes and streams. So don't forget that you can move your livestock back. You can plant vegetation that will help reduce the runoff from going into our lakes and rivers. And then prevent, like I just said, prevent access from animals coming up to the actual water source itself. So within our own cottages or homes, we can use phosphate-free products such as detergents and cleansers and personal care products, maintain a natural shoreline, and ensure that your septic system is far enough away from the lake and properly maintained so that it doesn't overflow and add those extra nutrients into our lakes and rivers. So what do you do if you suspect a harmful algal bloom? First of all, you want to use the precautionary principle. So just assume that the toxin is there and avoid exposure to water. So that would be drinking or swimming, for example. Along with, even if you have dogs, make sure that you're keeping them out of the water too. You can call the Spills Action Center, which is the Ministry of the Environment, to report the sighting. The Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks will do an assessment and determine if a sample is required. They are actually the lead agency when it comes to investigating harmful algal blooms. And then let your neighbors know, let your lake association know, so that they can help get the word out so that everyone can take precautions. So the limitations of testing, there's really only one way to confirm if the toxin is present, and that's through sampling your water. They are grab samples, so really what they're sampling is the water at the location where the bloom is actually present. It's not necessarily an indicator of the entire body of water. And it only represents the toxin that was taken at the time of the sample. So they do provide limited value in declaring an area safe. So after the bloom has flushed itself out, users, it's best to become aware and informed so that you can make your own decision when you want to actually resume recreational activities. So when public health, so what's our role as public health? When public health receives information from the Ministry of the Environment that a HAB is present, a public health inspector will conduct a risk assessment to determine if the public is at risk of the exposure of the HAB. So what we look at are the following. So we look at proximity of the bloom to recreational camps or children's camps, public beaches, small drinking water systems that may be drawing water from the lake, and then other businesses or locations where the public may be affected by the HAB. If there's a risk to the public being affected by the HAB, the health unit will notify the affected municipality and stakeholders, so whether it be a business or the lake association, and we provide advice that they can disseminate out to their members or the users to help take precautions against being exposed to the actual bloom. We may consider closing a public beach, and we actually had that happen last year. If you notice the picture that I have on the screen, this was a bloom that we had found at one of our public beaches last year. So you can really see the turquoisey, the blue-green color. So in that case, the beach was closed until the bloom had worked its way out, and then the beach reopened. It did take a few days for that to happen. We may have to issue drinking water orders if it's affecting a small drinking water system. So a small drinking water system are businesses that draw water from our lakes and rivers and used for the purpose of consumption or cooking. We require drinking water treatment systems that will help reduce toxin levels of the HAB. So for our small drinking water systems that do use surface water, we do require them to have water treatment. It's also important to note too that the Ministry of the Environment, with our large municipal systems, that treatment system that's treating that surface water has taken into account treatment for blue-green algae as well. So getting the word out. As a health unit, we really value the collaboration with our local lake associations and getting the messages out. They often have a pretty comprehensive list of the residents on the lake, and may have email addresses or mailing addresses, so we will send out notices that way. We also use newspapers and radio and social media to help get the messages out. However, we realize that there are some limitations in using those methods. So we really, if you have a bloom in your area, it is important to talk to your neighbors and friends just to let them know. So to sum it up, we really encourage everyone to learn about HABs and their health risks, how to recognize a HAB and what to do. So you want to contact your Spills Action Center, notify your neighbors and your lake association, avoid contact with water, and know the symptoms of exposure, and then of course monitor the bloom and local conditions. And we have lots of information on our website, so I invite you to visit our website at healthunit.org. And we're also, put information out on our social media. So please feel free to follow us on the appropriate social media channel for you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kim. That was a great presentation, very informative. So I'm just gonna share my screen here. And just so we know the next presenter, this is Frances Pick. So Frances Pick is a former professor at the University of Ottawa for the Faculty of Science. And she's also past chair of the Department of Biology, and she holds a PhD in botany at the University of Toronto, which she specialized in limnology and a minor in biochemistry. A lot of her research is focused on the effects and structures and functions of primary producers like cyanobacteria and algae and aquatic plants. She studied over the past 2 decades on how climate change is affecting these interactions in Canada's aquatic ecosystems. She's very knowledgeable, as you can tell, on this topic. So now that we know a little bit about Frances, we'll put it over to Frances for her presentation. And we are going to leave the questions until the end. We'll answer the pre-submitted questions first. And then if we have time, we'll go through the questions that have been submitted in the chat today.
So thanks, Natasha, and thanks, Kim. I'm going to share my screen. It's the first time. I hope you can hear me okay and see my slides.
They look great, Frances.
Everything okay?
Yeah.
All right. So thanks, Kim. Some of what I'm going to say overlaps a little bit with what Kim has presented, but the message is consistent. And anything that's repetitive, I will go through a little more quickly. Yes, my interest is in aquatic ecosystems and lakes, rivers, wetlands, and in particular, the algae and plants that grow in those systems. So today, I'm just going to talk briefly about blooms and HABs and focus mainly on the ecology of cyanobacteria and some of the causes of HABs. So algal blooms. So it's simply, as Kim said, you have this visible accumulation of algae. It can come in many different colors. The thing that's tricky is, they can last for a few days only, but they can last for months, or in some cases, like in the tropics, it's sort of a permanent of a water body. So they vary in frequency and size and intensity. Lots of different colors. I just pulled this one out of files. It's on the South Nation because we have the South Nation Conservation Authority, I think, with us today. And what I'm trying to show in each case is a little microscopic picture of the organism responsible. So this is sort of some green jello on the South Nation. Those of you that know the Rideau River in the summertime, in the back bays, you get these floating mats. They are green algae, and they are really thick. There's a lot of material in those mats, and there's kind of more of that stuff than there is, you know, aquatic plants like floating water lilies. So what concerns us most are these cyanobacterial blooms. This is actually from a lake in BC, that turquoise color. Anything that sort of slides towards the blue-green is most likely due to cyanobacteria. In this case, you can see that the water level has dropped and that there is a blue rim around the rock there and along the shoreline, and that's from cyanobacterial pigments that have sort of stained the rock. But sometimes, too, you can get these remarkable blooms that are pink or almost red. This was under ice in an Ontario lake, central Ontario, due to planktothrix. Not as common across Ontario, but once in a while we do see these types of blooms. You see them in British Columbia as well and in Quebec. And even into, you know, what we're seeing now are blooms as far north as Yellowknife here, Great Slave Lake, that's had these occasional blooms in August. And that's the image of the algal species that contributes to that bloom. You know, through the microscope, these things are quite beautiful. But we can see that some of these big blooms from space, and Environment Canada follows blooms via satellite and kind of can project forward what's going to happen through the summer on Lake Erie. Here on the top image, you see in the Western Basin, the green patch, and in the bottom there, that's Lake Winnipeg that is almost entirely green from cyanobacterial blooms. So one thing, though, that I should point out is that blooms, to a certain extent, are normal part of aquatic systems. So in temperate regions, you know, in the spring, when a lake turns over, it brings up nutrients and you get more algae growing, and that's perfectly normal. In fact, it's really critical for fisheries. It drives the rest of the food chain. And also, too, as that bloom dies off in the spring, it provides organic material for all those organisms that live on the bottom. So this is my little cartoon just to remind you, you know, that for algae and plants to grow, and algae, you need the sunlight, you need the CO2 from the atmosphere, you need nutrients, and that's what drives algal growth in the surface waters where there's sunlight, right? But the harmful algal bloom situation arises when the blooms exceed this so-called normal level, or if they arise at unusual times of the year. So what's the problem? When you have all that biomass, it can lead to what we call dead zones, so areas that have very little oxygen, and that can lead to fish kills. And it's what happens actually in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a large area of low oxygen that's causing declines in fisheries, declines in the shrimp fishery as well. And of course, as Kim has talked about, the fact that harmful algal blooms can produce these potent toxins that can sicken or kill animals. I thought I'd just list some of the animals that have been documented as having been affected and died as a result of exposure to algal toxins. And more broadly, of course, it raises the treatment costs for drinking water around the Great Lakes, for example, and it impacts industry that depend on clean water, and it impacts, of course, recreation, as Kim discussed, tourism and property values. So HABs in Ontario are largely the result of excess biomass of cyanobacteria, often producing these toxic metabolites. So one of the things to know about cyanobacteria in terms of their biology is that they have these little gas vehicles that help them regulate their position in the water column. So you can have a situation where, your lake looks reasonably clear. And then the next day or in the next couple of days, all of a sudden you get this bloom. And it's not because, the algae have grown within the 2 days. It's because of the fact that they migrated to the surface and sort of telescope up to concentrate in a lens in the surface of the water. Now, generally, this happens in warm and calm conditions, whereby they're sort of seeking more light, if you will. But once they get to the top, sometimes they lose that ability to regulate their position in the water column, and you have this scum that forms that then accumulates on shorelines because the wind will cause it to be brought into shorelines. So it's a very interesting behavior that they have that is unique to other, other algae in the water don't tend to do this. They don't have what's called buoyancy control. So they have these little sort of gas, like a balloon inside them that they can inflate or deflate to cause them to go up and down in the water. So your water can seem perfectly clear, but in fact, there's lots of cyanobacteria. There always are anyway. I mean, they're in every single lake. It's normal to have cyanobacteria. They're very ancient organisms, and there's all different kinds. They're not all bloom forming types. And it's really when you have quite a few of them, like on the water column on the left-hand side here, and then a change in weather can cause them to lose buoyancy control and then concentrate in the surface. So if there's a lot of them, then that causes that paint appearance of the surface water. So Kim's told you this, that the principal cause of harmful algal blooms is an increase in nutrients. And where do these nutrients come from? They come from sewage, wastewater, agricultural, or urban runoff. So you can go from a lake state that's nice and clear towards a lake that is more turbid, that has a serious harmful algal bloom problem. And generally, with impacts on the food chain of, problems, fewer fish because there's less oxygen, and some other species may disappear as well with this process that's called eutrophication. So we have a lot of evidence that phosphorus is the primary culprit for eutrophication. And we've known this for 40 or now 50 years. This is a classic experiment that was done in a pristine lake in northwestern Ontario, where the lake was divided in two with a curtain, and on one side of the curtain they added phosphorus and it was absent from the other side. So it's a pretty compelling experimental result that the addition of phosphorus causes lakes to turn green. And in this case, there was a shift from the normal algal community towards dominance by these cyanobacteria. So, you can see the green paint in this image. So this experiment was repeated, but it's this experiment actually that generated big legislative changes and put in the bans on phosphorus in detergents. So it had a big policy effect, and a big change took place in the 70s when we started to control the inputs of phosphorus, particularly from sewage treatment plants to surface bodies. But if you look, and I'm sure this is one of I think I have 3 charts for you, but the point here is that it shows you on the bottom part of the graph, what's called the x-axis is nutrients. So as nutrients increase, whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus, you get a concomitant increase in the amount of cyanobacteria. So you see that line rising. Each one of those dots is a lake in the US, which we were able to analyze. We don't actually have this kind of data for Canada, unfortunately, but I mean, Canadian lakes are really, in a lot of ways, no different than US lakes, particularly, upstate New York and so on, so close by to us. And so one of the questions that, appears to be still a little open-ended is, are we seeing more of these? Are we seeing this rise of slime in Canada? Well, anecdotally, yes. So the lower Great Lakes started seeing them in Lake Winnipeg and small lakes. There appears to be increasing number of reports. And this is from Ontario, an update of a paper that was done 10 years ago or so. So what this is showing is the number of water bodies reporting blooms in Ontario. And the top one is the total, and the one on the bottom is showing blooms for the first time. So this is data from the Ontario Lake Partner Program. Perhaps some of the cottage associations participate in this program. And so the question, of course, with these kinds of data, is this a real trend, or is this because people are becoming increasingly aware of the problem of cyanobacterial blooms, surface blooms, and we are getting more reports? I don't think so, and the next bit of evidence will tell you why I don't think this is the case. So the problem is we don't have a lot of continuous monitoring over time in lakes, but what we can do in the absence of surface water monitoring over time, we can go and take a sample of the lake sediments that actually record everything that's been going on in that lake since glaciation. So when you take this core of lake sediments, as shown in this picture here, you can take little slices and go back in time. So the top part of the core is more recent deposition, and as you go back, you're going back in time, and we can date these layers. So what this is showing is a compilation of cores from over 100 lakes in North America and in Europe. And it's showing you the change in cyanobacteria pigments, because some of these pigments actually preserve very well in lake sediments. And you can see this acceleration in the amount of cyanobacteria starting 1900s, but really beginning in the 1940s. And the acceleration is remarkably similar, actually, between Europe and North America. So, yeah, this is only 100 lakes, but it's pretty compelling that what we're seeing recently is an increase in harmful algal blooms. It's not just because people are reporting more, it's actually what's happening on the landscape. So aside from nutrients, what we're seeing perhaps is some evidence that blooms are also being triggered by changes in climate. And cyanobacteria seem to be favored by these warmer conditions. And the evidence in Canada comes from a couple of different observations. We see blooms in low nutrient lakes and sometimes late into the fall, which is a bit unusual. So lakes that normally would not have blooms because they have very little nutrients. For example, a lake in a park that hasn't had much change in the land use. We're seeing also blooms in rivers. That's a little bit unusual, but you see them during very hot and dry summers when the river becomes more like a lake and you have that stagnant water. We've also seen the arrival of a subtropical species in a lake in Ontario, which, it's something that requires 24 degrees Celsius in the bottom waters for it to do well. And we're seeing these blooms in the high latitude lakes, as I mentioned, Great Slave Lake. And this is perhaps because climate change, we know, leads to warmer water temperatures. You have a longer growing season. And the thing that's interesting about cyanobacteria is that they don't actually grow very fast. They tend to be sort of the tortoise and the hare. They tend to be the tortoise in that race. They're very slow growing. So you give them more time and there's more of them. The other thing we're seeing is, of course, less precipitation might lead to more stagnant conditions in lakes, more stratification, which I haven't talked about, but warmer waters And also, though, if we have a lot of precipitation certain times of the year, like in spring, that can bring in a lot of nutrients. So both situations can lead to higher cyanobacteria. And it's really interesting, increased fires may also lead to more cyanobacteria, because when you have fires, the ash that's generated by a fire and that's put into the atmosphere, that ash contains phosphorus, not a lot of nitrogen, hardly any nitrogen. It gets blown off into gas, but ash contains phosphorus. So that's one possible reason that climate change could lead. So we have a situation of harmful algal blooms, and there are many ways in which one can manage the situation. Of course, prevention, stopping a system from moving from that nice clear water situation to a scum situation. Prevention of the two ways of dealing with blooms, prevention is actually the cheapest way. Once a lake is at a state where it has continuous blooms, the restoration of that lake can be very, very expensive. And what we do know is that to address this issue, it takes research, it takes policy, and it takes citizen engagement. This is a list of the different approaches that have been used or are used to manage harmful algal blooms. In terms of policies, of course, the main one being reducing the usage and this can be in the form of conservation farming practices. You know, there are some jurisdictions in North America where phosphorus has been removed from fertilizers except for the agricultural sector. Also, phosphorus trading credits at the watershed scale for no increase in the amount of phosphorus in your watershed. Some areas, some property rebates for improving septic beds, and so on. So these are all efforts on the policy side to reduce the input of nutrients. There are chemical ways of precipitating and sequestering phosphorus. This is done, of course, in wastewater treatment plants that remove phosphorus before the stream is discharged, the waste stream is discharged into surface waters. There are physical things that can be done in terms of mixing and aeration in some select situations, and it doesn't all quite experimental. Removal of sediments in extreme cases, people have actually dredged water systems to get the nutrients out. On-site BMP stand for best management practices. Of course, the revegetation of shorelines, wetland creation. Biomanipulation is a little trickier, but that's because there are food web effects. We can kind of look at the food web as a whole to help minimize the dominance of bloom-forming species. So that was kind of a quick run through. There's many other areas that I could talk about, but it's kind of hard to cover everything in 20 minutes. So I think now it's time for questions. And Natasha, it's over to you.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Frances. That was a wonderful presentation. I am going to launch a poll to ask our viewers a few questions. So if you could, I'll launch that now. If you answer these questions, it's just helpful for us because then we can actually make our webinars better in the future and better understand what you've learned from our presentation. So there are 5 questions. If you're on a mobile device, it'll just pop up at the top. And then you'll just say view polls, and then you can answer all the questions and hit submit at the end. So I'll leave that up while I share my screen here. And then we'll move on to the questions that everyone has asked. So we'll start with the pre-submitted questions. We have them in our slideshow here. And then if we have time, we'll continue on to the questions that were submitted in the chat. So the first question that we got was, is there any way for a cottage owner to test their lake water for presences of microcystins and any other harmful substances produced by cyanobacteria? I think this one might be for Kim.
Yeah, so private labs will test your lake water for microcystins from blue-green algae blooms. However, it can take a bit of time, usually a day or so, to get results back. We have heard of test strips that people can use, but we really don't have a lot of good information to know how valid those test strips are, or the cost of them. So those ones I really kind of hesitate on. If you do suspect a bloom, the best thing to do really is to call the Ministry of the Environment. You can send them pictures. They'll do an assessment, an initial assessment, and if they feel that the water should be tested, they will actually come out and test the water. But the one thing you can do is just take a look at the water. So if the water is appearing cloudy, it might be a signal that a bloom is starting to form. And at that point, you would want to avoid using it for the purpose of swimming. And we always caution the use of surface water without proper drinking water treatment. And then just really kind of watch the water. And when I say foggy, I don't mean just, you've stepped in the water and the silt from the bottom has come up and then it settles. It's like if you step into the water, or you put your toes into the water, you can't actually see your feet type of foggy. So it's, and also going back to the smell, if your water's really starting to smell organic, again, it could be an indication that a bloom is starting to form. And then just really watch those cues. Surface water without a bloom will appear clear, or not clear, but it won't have that foggy appearance, and it won't have that scummy or paint-like look on top of the water.
Awesome. That's a great answer. Thank you, Kim. So our next one is, how long after a local cyanobacterial bloom has disappeared is lake water safe to use as a household source?
I can take this one again. It's very similar to the last question. So really use your senses, take a look at the water visually, smell the water. If you're getting that, fogginess or the appearance of a bloom on top of the water, then definitely don't use that for the purpose of recreational use or for the purpose of as your household water source. All water should be treated. And I know there is another question in regard to treatment, so I can get into a little bit more detail about that. If again, look for the visual cues and the actual smell of the water. If you're noticing a change, then obviously, like we said before, take that precautionary principle and avoid use.
Yeah. So the next question is kind of similar as well. How close to a water intake does a cyanobacteria bloom need to be to a lake water intake to pose a risk?
Frances, were you going to take this question?
Well, I could, yeah. So all these questions are really good. And so it's very context dependent, but I'd like to point out that these blooms move around, I have a good friend who's on Lake Champlain, and we did some work on the lake, and, the blooms were the first slide that I showed you was Lake Champlain on the Phillipsburg side. And, on her side of the bay, it's perfectly clear. It looks fantastic. 4 days later, that paint scum has moved across the lake and gone right in front of their intake. So these things will move around depending on the wind. So I'd hate to give an answer here, because in the situation of having a lake with blooms, it doesn't really matter where your intake is. your lake is affected by a bloom. I mean, I'm on a very, very small lake that's not even a kilometer long, and I've had cottagers say to me, oh, you're the one with the problem. We don't have the problem down at our end of the lake. And I go, no, we all have this problem. Just because the scum seems to accumulate, you know, because I'm on the kind of wind where the wind blows, doesn't mean you don't have a problem down your end of the lake. So, you know, if you've got a recurring problem on your lake, I mean, I hate to say this because it's an expense, but if you have a recurring problem of cyanobacterial blooms year after year, personally, my advice is spend the money, put a well in, because it's going to be really expensive otherwise, and you're never going to feel totally safe using that water.
And if I can just,
yeah, go ahead.
If I can just add, I agree. If you can afford it, put the well in. We have to remember that water used for household purposes from surface bodies of water is never safe, and there's more than just cyanobacteria that could be present in that water intake. There could be chemical contaminants, like we have boats, you know, that use gasoline and oil. So there's so many contaminants to consider in open surfaces, bodies of water, than just blue-green algae.
Yeah, thank you guys. That was a really good way to word it, especially when people think that it's just one person's problem, and when water is a shared community. Everyone in that community will need that water at some point, so it's good to have that kind of explanation. We are getting close to the end of the 1 hour. We'll continue to answer questions, but if you have to leave, no worries. If you are interested in one of the answers, we can provide you a recording, or just send us an email and we can find out the answer of your question. So moving forward, the next question we had was, are there any cyanobacteria and harmful byproducts filtration techniques available for cottage owners?
I'll take this one. There is, and you can purchase them through a water treatment company. I had seen a question in the chat very similar to this, so I'm hoping I can kind of answer both. So when it comes to treating surface water, it's not just one particular filtration technique. You have to run a series of filtration. So you'd want to have a 1 micron filter that will remove cyanobacteria, plus you have to have a reverse osmosis system. Plus you either have to have ozonation or chlorination that has retention tanks. So again, you're dealing with a chemical there. Plus you have to have a point of use filter on your actual faucet. So you can see that to remove cyanobacteria, it's a very complex system, and there is maintenance to these systems. So you really want to make sure that when you're dealing with a water treatment company, that the product that you're receiving has proper, you can read the manufacturer's instructions and detail, but you'd want to make sure that water treatment devices are actually say on there that they remove cyanobacteria. And the other thing I wanted to mention too is that, and regardless of what health unit you live in, the local health units within the area of Eastern Ontario have created a really good fact sheet called Harmful Algal Blooms, and you can find it on our website. But there is a whole section in there on water treatment for those who are using surface water. So, you know, you may just want to do cost analysis over time. Is it just as cheap to drill a well on your property versus the uptake and the cost of the treatment?
Thank you, Kim. The next one is, are there specific actions that everyone can take to reduce their contributions to potential algal growth? And what impacts does gray water have on algal blooms?
Yeah, so I can take this, and Kim could as well. So it's kind of what we had both said. I mean, it's about thinking about where all that nutrients may be coming from, right? So that shoreline vegetation is so important, and I would stress native vegetation as much as possible, because then you're kind of, there's lots of things we don't fully understand about a complete food web, right? And all the plants and animals that are required to have kind of a healthy ecosystem, right? So you want to ensure that there's very little runoff from your property. And also, think of the roads too. So ditches from roads that end up accessing to lakes, that's a big problem as well. And gray water contains nutrients. You might not think, you might be using phosphorus-free detergents and so on, so there's less, but it really doesn't take a lot of phosphorus to get algae growing. I mean, I wish I'd brought kind of one of those images where it's like, a little teaspoon in your lake can cause it to go, a little teaspoon of phosphorus can cause your bay to go green. So it really doesn't take a lot. So any wastewater will contain some nutrients. And you got to think the nutrients as like contaminants. They are contaminants for aquatic systems. So anything you can do, of course, having proper septic systems that buffer, all those things help. Don't feed the ducks, it's like it all adds, it can all contribute nutrients. So it's that simple, but that complicated actually.
Thanks for your answer, Francis. Next up is, did you have something to add, Kim?
I was just going to say, and then there's always the advocacy piece as well. If you are on a lake where you have a lake association, it might be, something to take to your association. The associations are great at getting information out to help your neighbors really understand what blue-green algae blooms are and the actions that they can take to reduce the amount of nutrients going into the lakes and other bodies of water. The other thing is you can contact your local municipality. Those that have lakes in their area may have done or can do a septic reinspection program. So you may, along with your lake association, advocate for your local municipality to take on that. So really the purpose of that is to make sure that the septic systems on the local lakes, including islands, are functioning properly and that the waste isn't going directly into the lakes.
Wonderful. Thank you for that addition, Kim. The next one was, what are your thoughts on the causes of cyanoHABs in places where eutrophication isn't an issue? And I think we were going to give that one to Francis.
Yeah, so I did mention climate change, and so warming of surface waters. We have we have examples of cases where we have, observed blooms, documented them, whether it's sort of, through monitoring or through looking at the sediment record, where eutrophication wasn't the cause and where climate change seems to be the cause. Another one that we haven't spent a lot of time on because it's sort of another facet, in areas, in lakes that have also seen zebra mussel invasion. You compare those lakes to lakes that don't have the zebra mussel in a similar area. We find that actually the zebra mussels will contribute to toxic blooms. So changes in the food web can have these sort of unexpected results. Also, too, if you have a shallow lake and there's a lot of plants, people call them weeds, but they're aquatic plants. That's actually a better situation than if those aquatic plants are eradicated, because if you remove those aquatic plants in a shallow system, they get replaced by cyanobacteria and you get toxic blooms. It's what's called the alternate state in shallow lakes. So if you remove the macrophytes, if you remove those aquatic rooted aquatic plants in a shallow lake, you can often see cyanobacterial blooms starting, right? So those are food chain effects that are kind of more difficult to anticipate, but we certainly know that can change a lake. So changes to the structure of the lake, invasive species can have an effect. But aside from the nutrients are kind of number one, if you will, and climate change is sort of aggravating eutrophication.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Frances. We can continue doing questions if everyone has time. Or if you'd like, we can stop the webinar and we can just go on